Living in the quiet suburbs of Colorado, life for me and my wife Jessica was seemingly perfect. Our neighborhood was a picturesque slice of Americana, tree-lined streets, kids playing in well-manicured yards, and a strong sense of community. We had a lovely home with a spacious backyard, perfect for barbecues and get-togethers with our friends and neighbors. I worked as an IT manager, and Jessica was a part-time interior designer, which gave her the flexibility to be home when our two kids, Emma and Jack, returned from school. Jessica and I met in college. She was the life of every party, a whirlwind of laughter and excitement, while I was the more reserved type. Opposites attract, they say, and for years, it felt like we complemented each other perfectly. Our social life was active, often filled with dinner parties, weekend trips, and spontaneous gatherings. Among our closest friends were our neighbors, Mike and Lisa. They were a bit more adventurous, always suggesting new activities and hosting the most elaborate parties. As life would have it, things started to change. The frequency of our intimate moments dwindled, but I chalked it up to the demands of parenting and work. Little did I know the changes in Jessica's behavior were more than just a phase. It was at one of these infamous parties at Mike and Lisa's house that my world began to unravel. It all started with subtle changes. Jessica was always a social butterfly, but recently her nights out had become more frequent, and her return times later. She'd come home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and with stories that seemed too rehearsed. "Just a few drinks with the girls," she'd say, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Our phone bills began to show an increasing number of calls and texts to Mike. "We're just planning the next big neighborhood event," she'd explain nonchalantly. But something about her demeanor felt off. Jessica, who used to share every little detail of her day with me, had grown distant and secretive. One night I noticed her sneaking off to the backyard for hushed phone conversations. When I asked who it was, she'd shrug it off. "Just Lisa, talking about her latest interior design project," she'd say. But there was an edge to her voice that didn't sit right with me. The turning point came when I found a receipt for an expensive lingerie set in her purse. We hadn't been intimate in weeks, and I couldn't recall the last time she'd bought something like that for me. My heart sank. But I pushed the thought aside, hoping it was just a gift for a friend or something innocent. Jessica's behavior at Mike and Lisa's parties also changed. She'd disappear for long periods, often leaving me to socialize on my own. When I'd find her, she'd be in deep conversation with Mike, their heads close together, sharing private jokes. "You're just being paranoid," I told myself, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter with each passing day. Her mood swings became more erratic. She'd go from being overly affectionate to distant and cold in a matter of minutes. One moment, she'd be draped over me, laughing and whispering sweet nothings. The next, she'd snap at me over the smallest things. It was like living with a stranger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My suspicions gnawed at me, but I was too afraid to confront her directly. Instead, I started paying closer attention, hoping to catch a clue that would either confirm or dispel my growing fears. Little did I know, the truth was far worse than I could have imagined. It was one of Mike and Lisa's legendary parties, known for their wild themes and uninhibited atmosphere. This particular evening had a swinging 70s theme, with everyone decked out in bell-bottoms and psychedelic prints. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and the air was thick with an electric energy that promised a night to remember. Jessica had been unusually excited about this party. She'd spent hours getting ready, slipping into a low-cut dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. "You look amazing," I'd told her, trying to ignore the pang of insecurity gnawing at me. She'd smiled, but it wasn't the warm, loving smile I used to know. It was a calculated one, almost predatory. As the night wore on, I noticed Jessica was drinking more than usual, her laughter louder and more frequent. She kept glancing at Mike, who was equally animated, whispering in her ear and making her giggle. My discomfort grew, but I kept my suspicions to myself, not wanting to cause a scene. At some point, I lost sight of her. I wandered through the crowded rooms, looking for my wife, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic started to set in as I checked the kitchen, the living room, even the backyard. Finally, I headed upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the top floor and heard muffled voices coming from one of the bedrooms. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see Jessica and Mike, tangled together on the bed. The sight was like a punch to the gut. Jessica's dress was hiked up, her bare skin glistening with sweat as she moved rhythmically on top of Mike. His hands gripped her hips, guiding her with a familiarity that made my blood boil. I burst into the room, rage and betrayal coursing through my veins. "What the fuck is this?" I shouted, startling them both. Jessica scrambled off Mike, her face a mix of shock and fear. Mike, on the other hand, had a smug grin that only fueled my anger. "You bastard!" I lunged at him, my fists flying. He managed to dodge the first punch, but I wasn't done. I grabbed a baton from a decorative stand nearby, a prop from the party's theme, and swung it with all my might. The baton connected with Mike's side, eliciting a pained grunt. I swung again, this time hitting his shoulder, then his legs, not caring about the damage I was inflicting. Jessica screamed, trying to pull me away, but I was relentless. The betrayal I felt was a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Mike tried to shield himself, but I was beyond reason, my vision clouded with fury. It wasn't until Lisa and a few other partygoers rushed in and pulled me off him that I finally stopped. Mike lay on the floor, bruised and bloodied, groaning in pain. Jessica was crying, her face pale and tear-streaked. "How could you?" I spat, my voice shaking with emotion. "How could you do this to me?" Jessica didn't answer, just sobbed helplessly. The room was a mess of shattered trust and broken hearts. The party had come to a screeching halt and all eyes were on us. My life had just been torn apart, and there was no going back. The aftermath of my explosive discovery at the party was a whirlwind of emotions and chaos. I stood there, breathless and seething, staring at the mess before me. Mike was groaning on the floor, clutching his side where I had struck him, and Jessica was a sobbing wreck, her tears smudging her mascara, making her look like a tragic clown. The guests at the party were in shock, their eyes wide and mouths agape, whispering among themselves. Lisa, trying to maintain some semblance of order, ushered everyone out of the room, leaving just the four of us in that cramped, tension-filled space. She gave Mike a look of both anger and pity, before turning her attention to Jessica and me. "What the hell were you thinking?" I roared, my voice echoing in the now silent room. Jessica flinched, her sobs intensifying. She tried to reach out to me, but I recoiled, the mere thought of her touch sending waves of disgust through me. "Please, Tom, let me explain," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Explain?" I spat back. "What is there to explain, Jessica? I saw you, I saw everything. You were fucking him, for God's sake." Jessica broke down completely, collapsing onto the bed. Lisa, torn between comforting her friend and glaring daggers at her husband, chose to stay silent, her presence a mere shadow in the corner of the room. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Jessica cried out, her words barely intelligible through her sobs. It just did." "It just did?" I echoed, incredulous. "You don't just accidentally end up in bed with someone else, Jessica. You made a choice. You chose to betray me, to humiliate me in front of everyone we know." She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy. "It wasn't like that," she whispered. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," I challenged, crossing my arms and glaring down at her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to compose herself. "It started a few months ago. I was feeling disconnected from you, from us. You were always busy with work and the kids, and I felt invisible." "Invisible?" I interrupted, my anger flaring again. "So your solution was to have an affair? To fuck our neighbor?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her voice rising. "I was lonely, Tom, and Mike was there. He listened to me. He made me feel wanted." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. So this was my fault? "You're blaming me for your infidelity?" "No!" she cried, shaking her head vehemently. "I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain how I felt. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for it to go this far." I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. My mind was racing, a cacophony of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. I couldn't believe this was happening. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, had torn it all apart with one reckless act. Mike groaned again, trying to sit up. Lisa finally moved, helping him into a sitting position and checking his injuries. "You need to go to the hospital," she said quietly, her voice cold. Mike shook his head. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his face was contorted with pain. I ignored them, my focus solely on Jessica. "Why him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Of all people, why him? She hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know, she admitted. He was just there. He was attentive. He made me feel special. It was exciting, and I got caught up in it. Special? I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. And what about me, Jessica? Did you ever think about how this would make me feel? How it would destroy everything we have? Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I know. I was selfish, and I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Tom. I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. I took a step back, feeling like I was drowning in a sea of emotions. I needed to get out of there, to escape this nightmare. I can't do this right now, I said, my voice breaking. I need to think. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, ignoring Jessica's cries for me to stay. I stormed down the stairs and out of the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I kept walking, my mind a chaotic swirl of thoughts and feelings, until I found myself at the small park at the end of our street. I sat down on a bench, burying my face in my hands, trying to make sense of it all. Hours passed as I sat there, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me like a heavy stone. I replayed the night over and over in my mind, each time feeling the sting of Jessica's actions like a fresh wound. I thought about our life together, the good times and the bad, and wondered where it had all gone so wrong. It was nearly dawn when I finally made my way back home. The house was silent, everyone presumably still asleep or in shock from the night's events. I quietly let myself in and made my way to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. Sleep eluded me as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind refusing to quiet. Later that morning, Jessica found me. She looked exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. She sat down next to me, hesitating before speaking. Tom, we need to talk, she said softly. I didn't respond, just stared straight ahead. She took a deep breath and continued. I know I've hurt you, and I know you probably hate me right now. But I want to try and fix this. I want to make things right. I turned to look at her, my eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. How do you propose we do that, Jessica? How do you fix something like this? I don't know, she admitted, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. I just want a chance to make things right. I laughed bitterly. And what about Mike? Do you think we can just pretend this never happened? She shook her head. No, I know we can't. But I'm willing to cut all ties with him, to do whatever it takes to rebuild our marriage. I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. Part of me wanted to believe her, to give her the chance to make things right. But another part of me was too hurt, too angry to even consider it. I need time, I said finally. I need to think about everything. She nodded, her expression one of defeat and sorrow. I understand, she whispered. Take all the time you need. She left me alone then, and I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind replaying the events of the past 24 hours. I knew that whatever decision I made, it would change my life forever. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional storm inside me refused to calm. Jessica had tried to reach out multiple times, but each attempt was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. She had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I couldn't let it go. The rage inside me simmered, looking for an outlet. One evening, as I sat in the living room nursing a drink, an idea began to take shape. If Jessica and Mike thought they could walk all over me, they had another thing coming. I wasn't going to sit back and play the victim. No, I was going to make them pay. I began by gathering information, carefully and methodically. Jessica's phone had become a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. Late-night texts, explicit photos, and rendezvous details. They were all there. I made copies of everything, knowing I'd need this ammunition for what I had planned. Next, I started planting seeds of doubt and discord. Lisa, already furious with Mike, was an unwitting ally. I began anonymously sending her some of the texts and photos between Mike and Jessica. The more she saw, the more her trust in Mike eroded. It wasn't long before their marriage was on the rocks, with Lisa growing increasingly suspicious and confrontational. But my main target was Mike. I waited for the perfect opportunity, And it came one rainy Friday evening. Mike often stayed late at the office, claiming he had to catch up on work. I knew better. He was using that time to chat with Jessica or meet up with other women. That night I followed him. Sure enough, he didn't head to the office, but instead drove to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. I parked a few blocks away and approached the motel on foot, the baton from that fateful night tucked under my jacket. I'd seen him check in, and I knew which room he was in. I waited for about an hour, my heart pounding in my chest, the rain soaking me through before making my move. I knocked on the door, hiding in the shadows. When Mike opened it, expecting someone else, I barged in, slamming the door behind me. The look of surprise on his face quickly turned to fear as he recognized me. "Tom, what the hell are you doing here?" he stammered, backing away. "I think you know exactly why I'm here," I replied coldly, pulling out the baton. His eyes widened with terror. "Listen, man, we can talk about this," he pleaded, raising his hands defensively. But I was past talking. The first swing caught him in the ribs, doubling him over with a grunt of pain. The next hit his shoulder, then his knee. Each strike was fueled by the rage and humiliation he had caused me. Mike fell to the floor, trying to crawl away, but I was relentless. I wanted him to feel every bit of the pain he had inflicted on me. He whimpered, trying to shield himself, but I was methodical, hitting him in places that would hurt the most but not cause permanent damage. I wanted him to suffer, to remember this night every time he moved. When I finally stopped, Mike was a broken, sobbing mess on the floor. I stood over him, breathing heavily, the baton slick with rain and blood. "If you ever come near my wife again, I'll finish what I started," I growled. "Do you understand?" He nodded frantically, tears mingling with the rain on his face. Yes, I understand," he whimpered. I left him there, walking out into the rain, my heart still pounding, but with a strange sense of satisfaction. I'd taken my revenge, and it felt good. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it gave me a measure of control back. The next step in my plan was to expose Jessica. I couldn't keep living with her, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew what she had done. I compiled all the evidence I had gathered, the texts, the photos, everything, into a neat little package. Then I sent it anonymously to everyone in our social circle. Friends, family, neighbors, they all received the damning evidence of Jessica's infidelity. The fallout was immediate. Jessica became a pariah overnight. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided her, and her social media accounts were flooded with condemnation and judgment. She tried to reach out to me, to explain, to apologize, but I wasn't interested. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The final act of my revenge was the most satisfying. I filed for divorce, citing adultery and providing all the evidence as proof. Jessica was blindsided, having believed we might still work things out. The look of despair on her face when she received the papers was a fitting end to our shattered marriage. During the proceedings, I made sure to play the role of the wronged husband to perfection. I presented my case calmly and rationally, while Jessica's emotional outbursts and hysterics only served to paint her in a negative light. The court sympathized with me, granting me full custody of the kids and a favorable division of our assets. Jessica's life fell apart. She moved out of our home, her reputation in tatters, and her relationship strained beyond repair. Mike's marriage didn't fare much better. Lisa had filed for divorce as well, and he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, physically and emotionally scarred from our encounter. As for me, I felt a grim sense of justice. My life had been upended, but I had taken control of the narrative. I wasn't just a victim. I had fought back and made sure that those who wronged me paid the price. Revenge had been sweet, but it came at a cost. I was left with the remnants of a life I once knew, trying to figure out how to move forward. But one thing was certain. I would never let anyone betray me like that again. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, Jessica asked to meet. She wanted to have one last conversation, a chance to clear the air and perhaps find some closure. Despite my lingering anger and bitterness, I agreed. I needed to hear her out, if only to put this chapter of my life firmly behind me. We met at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far away from the prying eyes and gossip of our old neighborhood. Jessica arrived first, looking tired and worn. She had lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her eyes, once so bright and full of life, were now shadowed with regret and sorrow. I sat down across from her, my expression unreadable. "You wanted to talk," I said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. "Tom, I know there's nothing I can say to make things right," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I betrayed you in the worst possible way, and I will always regret that." I remained silent, letting her speak. She took a deep breath and continued. "I loved you, Tom. I still do. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I got caught up in my own feelings of loneliness and insecurity, and I made terrible choices. Choices that I can never take back." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, trying to stay composed. "I know I've hurt you deeply, and I know I deserve everything that's happened. But I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you or our family. I was selfish and stupid, and I will carry that guilt with me for the rest of my life." I finally spoke, my voice cold and distant. "You didn't just hurt me, Jessica. You destroyed our family, our trust, everything we built together. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I hope that, in time, you can find some peace, and maybe, just maybe, we can be civil for the sake of Emma and Jack." The mention of our kids softened me slightly. They were the innocent victims in all of this, and they deserved parents who could at least be cordial. "I'll try," I said, my tone less harsh. "For them." Jessica looked up at me, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Tom. That means a lot." We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table to me. "I wrote you a letter," she said quietly. "I know it can't fix anything, but I wanted you to have it." I took the envelope, not sure if I'd ever open it. "Okay," I said simply. Jessica stood up, hesitating for a moment before leaning down and kissing me softly on the cheek. "Goodbye, Tom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I hope you find happiness again." "Goodbye, Jessica," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. She walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the envelope in my hand, wondering if I should read it or just toss it away. In the end, I tucked it into my pocket and left the shop, needing to put distance between myself and the memories of our life together. In the months that followed the trial, I focused on rebuilding my life and providing a stable, loving environment for Emma and Jack. The house felt emptier without Jessica, but it also felt calmer, more peaceful. The kids adjusted slowly, their resilience a constant source of inspiration for me. I threw myself into being the best father I could be. We spent weekends hiking, visiting museums, and having movie nights. I made sure to be present for every soccer game, school recital, and bedtime story. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Work became a refuge, a place where I could lose myself in projects and deadlines. My colleagues were supportive, giving me the space I needed to heal while also encouraging me to move forward. I found solace in the routine, the predictability of my job a stark contrast to the upheaval of my personal life. Slowly but surely, I began to open up to the idea of a new beginning. I started going out with friends again, rediscovering hobbies that I had neglected for years. I even went on a few dates, tentative steps towards finding companionship once more. It wasn't about replacing Jessica, but about allowing myself to heal and grow. One evening, as I was tucking Emma and Jack into bed, Emma looked up at me with her big, innocent eyes. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine." Jack, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we've got each other, right?" "Exactly," I said, feeling a swell of pride and love for my kids. "We've got each other, and that's all we need." As I closed their bedroom door and headed downstairs, I felt a sense of hope that had been missing for a long time. Life had thrown us a curveball, but we were stronger for it. We had faced the storm and come out the other side, ready to embrace whatever the future held. I sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out the envelope Jessica had given me. I had kept it all this time, unsure if I would ever read it. With a deep breath, I opened it and began to read. The letter was filled with apologies and regrets, a heartfelt attempt to explain her actions and express her sorrow. She wrote about her struggles, her feelings of inadequacy, and her hope that one day I might find it in my heart to forgive her. It was a letter of closure, a final chapter in our story. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but I was ready to let go of the anger and move forward. My new life was waiting, full of possibilities and the promise of a fresh start. As I looked out the window at the setting sun, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I knew that with my kids by my side and the lessons I had learned, we would be okay. We were stronger than the betrayal, stronger than the pain, and ready to embrace whatever came next.